Doctor, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening and thank you.
All right. What is the General Assembly and how does the debate provide a voice to the smallest of the 189 member states?
Well, the General Assembly is an important platform for all member states to express their views, concerns about issues affecting them and humanity at large. While the the decision of, one can say, if you may go back a little bit, the importance of the General Assembly has to a certain extent declined because during the 70s and the 80s, issues of disarmament, issues of decolonization were at the forefront of the agenda of the UN General Assembly. And therefore, it was the conscience of humanity in terms of articulating the aspirations of the people and, of course, the whole issue of security. So whereas, while its decisions may not be binding, I think it keeps the conscience of the world alive to the issues, the sufferings, and whereas the General Assembly itself may not take action, but its member states take action, and its decisions help in mobilizing public opinion in a number of countries. And that's why you had a lot of solidarity actions in support of our independence, solidarity action in support of the Palestinian people, as well as the people of Western Sahara. And without the UN decisions also do influence the foreign policy of a number of countries. So it is a very important organ.
All right. Africa has been pushing for a permanent representation at the UN Security Council, but there appears to be little movement. What can a continental body like the AU do to help achieve that?
Well, I think the problem of the issue of the reform of the Security Council and Africa's position in particular is that, you know, the agenda for the reform of the Security Council has been coming a long way. Now, if you recall, way back when the issue of China becoming a permanent member of the Security Council, it was one agenda item, and it was one country, and countries have to vote whether China should become or should not become a member of the Security Council. Whereas now, when Africa is pushing to become members of the Security Council, it is part of a broader reform agenda that involves not only Africa, but also countries in Latin America wanting representation, such as Brazil, other countries in Asia, in addition to China, India wants to have, and also European countries, whereas they are overrepresented with the UK and France being permanent members. Countries like Germany also want to join and become permanent members. And then, of course, there are also opposing views. There are other countries, European countries, that feels that, you know, in as much as Germany is an important country in terms of contributing to the budget of the UN and so forth, they are in the same position. Italy has been vocal, saying they lost the Second World War like us. Why should they become permanent member of the Security Council? So if Africa was the only item on the agenda, whether Africa or an African country should or should not become, it would be a different kind of debate. But now it's a total reform of the system. And then Africans also, you know, complicated their own issue because they have not put forward a candidate. We have the Isolani consensus, and that demands a number of seats, permanent, non-permanent, and therefore it has really not made progress. And of course, it will all depend on the permanent members of the Security Council. They can wield veto, and so yes, there has not been any progress on that.
All right. Now, Doctor, the SDGs are almost 10 years old since their adoption, which was in 2015. Where do you think we are now in terms of achieving these goals?
Well, we are actually very far from achieving those goals. In fact, the report of the Secretary General states that out of 17 goals and 169 targets, only 15% have been met. And they have also been reversal. Areas where progress were made have actually been also reversed. So we are quite far away from meeting those targets. The issue of hunger is among us. The issue of quality of education is of concern. The issue of health. The issue of environmental sustainability is also a challenge. And in the issue of, generally you can say, let me say that unlike the Millennium Development Goals that targeted only developing countries, the SDG is a global agenda and also, therefore, also involve developed countries. And developed countries have greater capacity to meet the SDGs, but they fail on the issue of climate change. They fail to reduce their carbon emission. And it's not only, you see, when we fail to meet certain objectives within Africa, it affects only our own people. But when they fail, it affects the rest of us, because their carbon emission is causing global warming. That causes drought, desertification, rising sea levels in the islands. Some of the islands are almost underwater, and that is because of the consumption and lifestyle of the developed countries.
All right. Now, financing is also very important in achieving the goals, and it's expected of individual countries to mobilize their local resources to bankroll the SDGs. But, Doctor, is it possible for poor countries?
Well, I think the poor countries have no choice than to do everything within their power to develop their countries and their people. They have to mobilize their resources. And so the question of the SDGs, these are global targets. And we are talking about solidarity. And therefore, there should be mechanism for transfer of resources from the rich to the poor. And that has been traditionally happening through development aid, but no country actually developed through development aid. But it was through trade investments that they have been able to develop. So countries have made progress in many areas. We are not exactly where we were 10 years ago in many fields. But the issue of mobilizing resources is critical. Now, the difference between the commitment, countries commit to mobilize resources. They don't pledge resources. And that's a big difference. Okay. If you pledge resources, then, you can be held accountable. But if you commit to mobilize, you cannot be held accountable. So that is the problem. It's like a moral issue, and so there are different commitments by countries. And then apart from that, the financial architecture, also the financing for development is an issue of concern. International financial institutions are making it difficult for developing countries to access finances. The cost of money is very high. So it is quite a challenge.
All right. But Doctor, what are your expected outcomes of the UN General Assembly regarding the SDGs?
Well, the General Assembly, as you may know, was preceded by a high-level summit on SDGs. And the reason that was the case is because they realized we are far off the target. And there are so many other global crises, political, the coups in West Africa, political instability in different parts of the world, the war in Ukraine and all that. And of course the COVID and all those things. But at the end of the day, the question is, the SDG is still the most important agenda for the UN now. It's really the question of development. Of course, one can say peace and security is important, because without peace and security, there cannot be development. But the development agenda has been pushed into the background for too long a time, and it has to be at the forefront. And therefore, the heads of state, right from the beginning of the high-level summit on SDG, have recommitted themselves to accelerate the implementation of SDGs. But the mechanism for that are still to be worked out. Obviously, they talk about the stimulus for the implementation of the SDGs, the issue of trade, issues of localization, that is where local mobilization of resources comes in, the question of capacity of local government to implement, and or public sector capacity, and of course taking advantage of digitalization. So these are some of the issues, but still there are a lot of questions that remains to be answered in terms of financing for development.
All right.
Where are the funds going to come from?
All right. Dr. Mbuende, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We wish you all the best.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right. That was Dr. Kaire Mbuende, who is a former diplomat, talking to us about the significance of the UN General Assembly.